All right, welcome to FACT's webinar called Designing Silvopasture Plantings. Our presenter today is Steve Gabriel from Wellspring Forest Farm in Cornell University Small Farms Program. I am Larissa McKenna. I'm FACT's Humane Farming Program Director, and I'm going to be moderating today's session. So thank you very much for being here. Let me just start with a few quick introductions before we dive in. Food Animal Concerns Trust, or FACT, we are a small nonprofit organization. We're based out of Illinois, and we promote the safe and humane production of meat, milk, and eggs. I direct the Humane Farming Program, which means I get to work with farmers and ranchers all across the country. And we offer a range of services, including grants, for which we are currently accepting applications. We have scholarships, a mentorship program, and of course, webinars on a variety of topics. So I invite you to visit our website for more information about all of our services. At this time, I'm very, very pleased to introduce our presenter. You see him here, you see him above on the video feed, Steve Gabriel. He's an agroforestry extension specialist for the Cornell University Small Farms Program, and he's also the managing editor of Small Farms Quarterly. He's co-founder of Finger Lakes Permaculture Institutes and has written several books about silvopasture. Along with his wife, Liz, Steve stewards Wellspring Forest Farm and School in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York, where they produce mushrooms, shiitake mushrooms, duck eggs, maple, and elderberry syrup, pastured lamb, and forest fruits. So we are super lucky to have Steve with us this week and for the next couple of weeks to learn about his experience and his expertise. So I think I'm just going to pass it straight on over to you, Steve, so you can get started.
Great. Thanks so much. And nice to have everybody here. Thanks for joining us this afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you're coming from. I'm going to actually say hello. I like people to see my face, but I'm going to turn off the video and share my slides with you just to make sure it's nice and smooth. So we're going to talk today about planning for silvopasture plantings, give a little bit of background, and we'll continue that conversation a bit next week where we talk specifically about tree care, species selection, and that sort of thing. And then we will finish the third week focused on animals. So I call that talk Right Animal, Right Place, Right Time. So we're kind of going to drill into different aspects. There's a whole world of things to talk about with silvopasture, and we'll just get into a little sliver of it as we go here. So just let me know, make sure you can see my screen here. It's a Miro. It's kind of like a whiteboard instead of slides. We're going to be a little more dynamic, hopefully today. If someone could confirm in the chat, that'd be awesome, just so I know you're seeing that board on here.
Yes,
I'm going to try to
we see you, Steve.
Okay, awesome, thanks. And the only other thing I'll do is I'll switch back and forth a little bit between a Google Earth. So if you don't see something at some point, just pipe in, let me know. So just a little more about us and our farm here. Our vision for Wellspring Forest Farm is farming in what we call farming in the image of a forest, or leaving a forest in our footsteps. So when we first encountered our farm, it's about 50 acres in central New York, beautiful Finger Lakes region. What we inherited was a legacy of degraded land, land that had been cleared or otherwise abandoned, ignored. In many cases, all the wooded areas were really overgrown thickets of brush. The pastures were beat up, didn't infiltrate any water, and had very little health in terms of the soil and very little structural diversity. It was really just a mowed field. And so that was what the previous farmer chose to leave us. What we want to leave the next generation is a forest in our footsteps, and not just a conservation-oriented forest, but a productive forest that also supports agricultural production. And I started out in ecology and conservation. I really believe that farming is the critical way that we will achieve the sort of environmental goals that we might have around habitat restoration, around improving water quality and restoring active wildlife corridors and things like that. And so that's really been the orienting feature for us to keep coming back to and thinking about. So silvopasture is one of the strategies we employ. I like to think of agroforestry as sort of an umbrella, and silvopasture being one of the things under that umbrella that we can utilize. So we do forest farming on the farm, where we grow mushrooms in the woodlands. We also tap the trees for maple syrup. And we work a bit with ducks as well as our pastured lamb. We do some elderberry, which integrates nicely with some of our pasture plantings, and also plantings around wet areas, creeks and wetlands and things like that. And we're engaged in a number of different kind of agrotourism things. Maple Fest usually happens every spring. It didn't happen this year. Hopefully we'll be back next year. Tours, workshops when we're able to, and then we have summer rentals on the property as well. So we're a small diversified farm. My wife Elizabeth and I both work in education for agriculture, and so when we're not actually farming, we get to talk to others and support others in that, which is a real gift and a privilege for us to be able to do. We like to mention always at any talks we go, any places that we talk about the places that we come from and the ways we identify those places. So we could say that we live in the Finger Lakes region of New York, which is true, or we live in a little town called Mecklenburg, New York, which is what is now the lands that we live on. But for a much longer time, deep into history, we are farming and living on Goyonkono lands. Goyonkono is the Cayuga name for the Cayuga in their own language, and I've been really lucky to connect with members of the nation and actually learn a bit about the language, including how to pronounce their name and other aspects of stewardship that have persevered in this part of the world. And I just want a presence that we're all sitting on lands that have an indigenous story, and an indigenous a past, a present, and a future. And it's really important, I think, for all of us in whatever relationship we have with land to also think about that relationship to the indigenous people who, in most cases, were dispossessed, in most cases forcibly dispossessed of that land. And in addition, a lot of the things we're going to be talking about today, the agricultural practices, we sometimes hear them called agroforestry or regenerative agriculture or permaculture or organic. These are all originating in many indigenous land use practices from around the world. So when I studied silvopasture, one of the important things was to connect those threads and think about where the influences come from. We don't always recognize and uplift and honor those origins, which are really important. So if you're in North America and you're not familiar whose land you are on, you can go to this link at the bottom right, nativeland.ca, and you can look at a map and find a bit more about the folks who have been on those lands for a very long time. Our stewardship that we work with is about 50 acres, as I mentioned. It's about 50% in woody species dominant, and 50% in open pasture. About a third of the land we lease, and then the other parts of the land we hold title to. And so it's really been a fun piece of property to work with silvopasture because we have a lot of restoration work to do. We don't have a lot of old growth or even older forests. It's really a lot of young, abandoned agricultural land that we inherited to work with. And so we have a lot of work to do in restoration that aligns with our farm goals as well as with the productive goals for these different systems. And before we dive a little bit more into silvopasture, I just want to mention that we do a website, silvopasturebook.com. There we we'll have handouts from some of the slides today as we go. We have an online course. It's actually just wrapping up the live portion, but you can sign up for the online course anytime and access all the back webinars, and then you'll be in the queue the next time we host live webinars to attend those. You get lifetime access to the online course, which is designed to be a companion to the book, which you can also order on the website. And then other speaking and online things we're doing are also listed on the website. So that's a good resource to go to after this and find more links and resources to explore on your silvopasture path here. So what I want to do is go to just a brief discussion of what silvopasture is, and then we'll dive a bit into the planning process that we've learned from our own work on our farm, as well as working with a number of different landowners through our education and sort of consulting work to support implementing silvopasture. And I think many people agree that silvopasture is a good idea. It makes sense on a basic level, but it's challenging to implement in a successful way. So My personal definition for silvopasture these days is something that recenters the things I'm most focused on. So, ecological restoration for livestock habitat. The reason I focus on livestock habitat is because I think if we start to think about our animals and our livestock as wild creatures in a sense on the landscape, and we start to think about creating different types of habitats, then we start to think about their different needs at different times of year, both in terms of food and intake, medicinals, as well as food plants, different types of shade or shelter, and basically something that's interesting, that's not the same kind of thing day after day, because these animals don't want to eat the same meal day after day, just like you and I don't want to eat the same meal day after day. And so if we just start to think about habitat, for me, that's really helped connect back to when I used to study, wildlife and birds and beavers and bears and all these different things that um, we talk about their habitat and all these kind of interesting things, but when we come to livestock, we often really reduce it down to something, I think, overly simplified. And silvopasture offers a really great route to establishing habitat for animals. I think most commonly, what we see in definitions for silvopasture would be the sort of interface or the intersection or the relationship between three main elements: the forages in the pasture, there at the bottom, the trees, and then the livestock themselves. And I like to think of us, though, we need to be in this, because what we're doing is we're acting as sort of an orchestra conductor, in that we're trying to get all these parts to play well with each other at the right time and in the right place, just like a well conducted orchestra. And so what's key is to understand the different needs of these parts, and understand those parts are always changing and they're incredibly dynamic. And so an important tenet, important basis for silvopasture is rotational grazing. If you're in a situation where you're still working on a rotational grazing as an improvement to your management, that's a good place to start before adding in more complexity with silvopasture. Get your rotational grazing system down and then start thinking of adding more complexity. Because if you try to learn about rotational grazing at the same time that you learn about planting trees and maintaining trees, and that you're learning about forage and pasture quality, you might get a little bit overwhelmed and the music might not sound so good. So keep in mind and think, I constantly am thinking about which of these elements I need to focus in on a bit more, and how they relate to these other three. And my role, I'm not doing the work. I'm not photosynthesizing the sun. I'm not growing the roots and stimulating the fungal networks and creating woody material. And I'm not eating grass and pooping it all out again and fertilizing. And those creatures, those beings are amazing at doing these things. And our job is to be those conductors and hopefully stay out of the way for the most part, if we can get them all to the right place. And so silvopasture really can take two major forms. We could kind of come from two different directions. So woodland conversion would be where we start with a existing wooded, either more mature forest, or even just overgrown woody vegetation as our main vegetation type. And then we're trying to open that up and find ways to increase the amount of pasture forage underneath. And then there's trees and pasture, which would be putting trees and placing trees into open pasture. And so our talk today, and to a good degree tomorrow, is going to focus more on the trees and pasture side of things. But it doesn't mean to say that woodland conversion isn't also a potentially important strategy. And each of these kind of have their pros and cons, and neither is, I would say, easier than the other. And there's pitfalls with both of these. So, for example, with woodland conversion, we could open up our forest too much too fast and actually have a negative impact on the residual trees, from many different standpoints, from excessive wind to excessive sun to trampling, or problems with the livestock themselves. With trees and pasture, this is a nice idyllic photo from an old orchard in the UK, where in parts of Europe, orchard grazing has been a long time common practice. But it's very easy to imagine putting sheep into a mature orchard, but probably most of us are thinking more about, well, how do I plant that orchard and keep those buggers off long enough to get the trees growing so they don't girdle the bark or strip the vegetation or something like that. So there's a challenge in how do we bring animals through a system while we're also trying to establish trees. And that's the main thing that we're going to kind of dig into a bit more today. So that's kind of a basic overview of silvopasture. Let's zoom out here and talk a little bit about the planning process itself. So again, each of these kind of things, I like these. I'm just trying to break up. Sometimes I've been on a lot of a lot of calls and presentations, and so the slides get to me. So I like this version of kind of zooming in and out because it helps you understand the bigger concept. So each of these slides will be a handout available as a download on our website, as I mentioned. So you can take some notes, but you can also know that you can access this stuff later. So really, when we talk about planning for silvopasture, and this does apply either for woodland conversion or for putting trees into pasture, we have kind of four main steps of what we need to think about and focus on. So we're going to kind of zoom into those. And the first would be we select what we might call an area of interest. So an area of interest is really simply something you might be familiar with this from like soil sampling or something. You're just selecting an area of land that you're going to focus on. And I wouldn't recommend starting with the entirety of whatever you might be thinking about. I would start as small as you can reasonably imagine implementing silvopasture. So the example here is, a woodland conversion. This is a 2-acre parcel on our farm, and we identify this as an area of interest because it has similar ecology and also a similar way that we're going to go about managing it. And those are generally the two pieces of criteria that we think about in terms of identifying a space. So, for instance, to the right of that yellow box is a deeper forest that has some wetlands in it. So it's a different ecology altogether, different species composition, different hydrology, and also we're going to end up managing that differently. For instance, grazing it only in the driest of times and maybe not on some years when it's too wet. Versus this area that we have highlighted, we're going to graze hopefully on a multi-annual basis. So I recommend other things to think about. Start with an area that you can walk into and within very often. So it's very hard to continuously visit 50 acres, but I can focus on this 2 acres as I'm thinking about how to develop silvopasture. And I want to not just walk the same path, but actually want to explore the different nooks and crannies of this space. So whatever area you feel like you can do that in, that's a good place to start. And then we always recommend with silvopasture, whether you're doing woodland conversion or you're doing trees and pasture, to start with your more marginal areas. So leave the healthiest forests as to be healthy forests, and leave your healthiest pastures to be healthy pastures. Start with the areas that really need some work and support, and put your time, energy, and resources there. And silvopasture can offer an opportunity for that restoration work. And then maybe someday you'll think about ways to integrate with those healthier systems. But I know every grazer that I've talked to in our experience is that we know the pastures where the grass does really well and is some of our most valuable space. And we know those pastures where the forages and the grasses persistently do poorly, right? So that's where we might want to start thinking about changing the mix a bit. So once we figure that out, then we really need to do some assessment of the site itself, the ecology of that site, and the qualities. And the two questions I like to ask is, what is the general character of the site? If I was to describe the site to you, how would I be useful in describing the main features and sort of the orienting pieces? Often, one or more of these qualities tends to define a site and kind of prioritize itself over the others. So many of the areas that we've identified on our farm, the dynamics of water tend to dominate what's going on there. Other farms I've worked on, I just visited one the other day where the slope was the defining feature, and the aspect, the direction the slope was facing, really defined the vegetation, the layout, and how we were going to think about going about our planning, right? So we look for things that really show up as primary or focus points, and then go from there. And once we assess that, what we're asking is, what's going on there? How do we continue to work with that, or what needs remediation? What needs some help or support? And we learned this, a hard lesson for us, in that 2-acre silvopasture that I showed as an example over here. We didn't really center water when we first designed this about 4 or 5 years ago. And we thinned out the forest beautifully, and we had stuff starting to show up in the understory. But the persistence of water, because we hadn't managed the larger hydrology of the landscape, basically made it really hard to establish the preferred pasture mixes that we wanted. So we had to go back and do the water management, and lo and behold, it's much easier to establish good pasture, right? So I wish we had done that from the get-go. This is before I decide what I want to do. So I'm really just paying attention to the ecology and the different aspects of the site, and trying to work within those constraints or those opportunities as we go. Then we really have to, I think, sit a bit with our goals. Why do we want to do silvopasture here? Because I will tell you, silvopasture will not take initially less time, energy, or resources. It'll take more. It is an investment in the landscape. Now, that investment can be supported through a lot of different means, and we talk about that a bit in our online course. We can see the different ways that trees benefit our livestock. They might save us money, and there's good research to show how shade and shelter help increase animal comfort and also their productivity. Um, there's different ways that silvopasture plantings can be subsidized through different state, federal grants and cost shares and things like that. We have some funding through the NRCS in the U.S., the Natural Resource Conservation Service, to help us with some of our silvopasture, right? So there's ways to do it, but just know from the outset that it's going to take a little more extra time, energy, and resources. So the question is, well, why do I want to do this? These are some of the answers that I put to the forefront, as well as many of the folks in our class. When we think about the different reasons, for us, silvopasture became really critical as a climate mitigation strategy, especially during drought or excessively dry seasons. So we want to have that shade and shelter for our livestock to reduce the impacts of hot and dry summers. And we also want to do the intentional production of fodder, which would be food for animals coming from woody vegetation. And we're actually engaged right now in a 2-year grant where we've been testing different tree species on our land, doing a nutritional analysis, and learning about how to manage them as fodder species for our livestock. And they've proven really important. This was a very dry year for us, and the fodder became incredibly important to get the animals through the grazing season. You can see the first year report from that study on our website on the homepage, and we'll have the second year sometime this winter, we just finished our second year of data collection on that. So your own goals are going to be unique to you, unique to the site. It's probably an intersection of multiple goals, but it really helps to articulate these and be as clear as possible as much as you can, because it really helps drive the design. And many times when I'm working with an individual on their land, I try to really drill that home, because if they can tell me exactly what they're looking for, we can really fine tune the design to meet that. So all these things may sound great to you, but a couple of them may be more or less important, or the reasons that you're really going after this. And I think that's important to focus on and think of, because it'll drive things like how we develop the site, how we choose our species, and so forth. And then finally, the fourth piece to this, if I can get over there, the ever important question a farmer should always ask themselves: what am I going to screw up? What's the possible set of errors I could make that I'll really kick myself for later? All right. So we see this with silvopasture. It's a concern that a lot of people express with planting trees, is imagining what those trees are going to look like in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, and what could happen if, for instance, they don't have access to their equipment anymore. Or the ever prominent error of buying too many trees, not having a place for them, and then they all die, and you've just kind of flushed the money down the drain. So these are things that we see commonly showing up. Just again, some more examples. There's probably more of these, but to really think through, where could I go wrong, and how can I avoid that through planning ahead of time? It'll save you time, energy, money, and frustration. One thing that I was really cognizant of early on in thinking about silvopasture was that I knew that I didn't want to have to protect and keep the trees and the livestock separate for very long. I was really wary of the idea that I had to wait like 10 years for the trees to be ready to be integrated back in with the livestock. And so that factor for me led me to really focus on a subset of trees that were very resilient and could tolerate a little bit of browse if they happened to find their way into a sheep's mouth, or that grew fast enough so that after 5 years I could put the animals back in with the livestock. And so it really reduced the tree list I had from dozens and dozens of different species to just like less than 10 that I could imagine would grow that fast and be tolerant of that type of environment. And we'll talk a bit about those in the webinar next week. Right. So these 4 different things really are questioning: what's the area I want to work with? What's the environment of that area? What are my goals? And then what could go wrong? And so it's pretty basic, but it's a really important reflection to go for. And I think what a lot of people do is they skip this and they go right to okay, what species am I going to get? I'm going to order them, and then I'm going to figure out the rest later. And I guarantee you that the more you think about these things and work with them ahead of time, the better off you're going to be when you actually go to buy the trees or the fencing or all those kind of different things. So I'll pause there for a second. I'm just going to check the chat. and see if there's any questions bubbling up, because it's nice to answer a few so we don't have a big pile at the end of the webinar. So if you have a question you want to put in the chat, we'll take a few right now about the design process or silvopasture as a whole. And then where we're going next, just so you know, is we're going to zoom into talking a bit about how trees and forests grow as a way to understand how we're going to design our silvopasture. Right, so we'll preview there. Okay, so a couple questions here. Will I be addressing ideas such as hedgerows, pollarding, coppicing? Also, invasive buckthorn's a big issue in our area. Ideas about converting invaded forest areas will be appreciated. So, a couple things there. I won't be addressing hedgerows, pollarding, and coppicing in detail in this talk, but certainly something that in the book and the larger class and things we do, we get into. There's just too much to it's sort of too fine of a point of what I want to focus on for this series here. Buckthorn, interestingly enough, is one of the species that we study in our fodder study, and what we found is the incredible amount of crude protein content, digestibility, and also micro and macronutrients that buckthorn presents. And we actually have shifted from seeing it as a non-native species to one that's really valuable. It does very well vegetatively, as you're probably aware. And we can manage that, I think, in a way that actually benefits our silvopasture and provides emergency fodder for our livestock. And it also stays, I have to say one more thing, is it stays green. It's still green. It's not one of the only trees that's still green in our silvopastures here. And it's actually a late season fodder as well, which is really unique. So I would encourage you to consider what is already growing there and if it could potentially be a useful food source. Because it's always less energy to manage what is there than to rip it out and put something else in that you then have to take care of and coddle. So we're not encouraging buckthorn to spread. We're actually actively managing and keeping it in check by using it as a tree fodder for our grazing animals. So that's kind of generally what I would encourage you to chew on and think about, ruminate on a bit. Jessica's asking if it's possible to do silvopasture under pine trees. Absolutely. And one of the areas that we utilize for silvopasture is a pine plantation. We utilize that for what we call like a living barn in the winter, because that provides from us a shelter from the wind and the snow. And you can also thin out conifer forests quite well and get forage established. You just want to be careful and think about, and we'll talk a bit about this, about the potential soil dynamics that might be at play in establishing forage. But I have seen some nice ones, and conifers really offer that year-round protection. So especially in climates where winter becomes a challenge or the swing seasons, they can be a really beneficial area for our animals. All right, I see some more questions here. Let me see if there's one more I want to take on for now. I appreciate this. Okay, what tools do I use to clear woody debris? I'll use that. I'll take that one, and then we'll move on, and I'll revisit some questions. So one of the tools we use is the animals themselves. They're the most cost-effective way to control vegetation. So we can use that. So one strategy is in the winter, we will fence them in an area that we want them to work on, and we'll give them their hay bales in the morning, and then they're done with those in an hour or two, and now they're looking around thinking, well, what can I do next? And lo and behold, I can go and strip this buckthorn, or I can strip this honeysuckle for the next few hours, and they'll girdle that, often to the point where the following spring, if we leave them in there long enough, we can drive over the debris with a tractor and actually just kind of crunch it down. It's all dead. We've used hand tools for certain things. We put animals during the grazing season when the vegetation is alive, and we'll do pruning as a way to feed our animals and see that as a way to remove or control vegetation, whether we want it to be there or not. We've used larger machinery like brush hogs or forestry mulchers on a skid steer, where we're actually going through and mechanically clearing and shredding or chipping material to open up larger pieces of land. And of course, like chainsaws and things like that are also tools we use. So we use a wide range of tools, and it all depends on how much impact you want to do. I always think of back to ecology. I'm creating a disturbance, and so how dramatic a disturbance do I want? If the more dramatic the disturbance, the more I have to then remediate. I have to put down cover crop seed. I have to think about what else could show up if I open up too much too fast. Versus pruning or lopping is a small intervention on the landscape. So we really value all those different types of tools, and I think they all have their different place as we look at different sites and contexts. Okay, so I'm going to dive back in here to the slides. So I want to talk just a little bit about how trees grow, and then I want to talk about how forests grow. Just a couple snippets of what could be a whole talk in and of itself. But why we study ecology always in agroforestry is because we want to understand the key learnings so that we can do things well. And I think that a particular with silvopasture, a really common thing is that farmers aren't used to planting trees. If you've been farming for a long time, there's probably people have told you for a long time you should get the trees out of the pasture, and here I am telling you to put them back in. And a lot of farmers don't have a lot of experience planting trees, and so we want to talk about those basics if we're going to be successful. All right. So any tree that you see out in the landscape is a factor of a few different things, and we could break it down to kind of four major things determining the success of a given type of tree in a given place. So the soil is really important, both the topsoil and the upper layers of soil, but also the bedrock has a big influence on what trees will grow there long term. So certain soils around here support sugar maple versus support oak and hickory and things like that. There's a term for that in forestry called site index, which rates kind of how well a tree can grow on a given site. The microclimate of an area grows is really important to how trees grow. So oaks and hickories, again, around here like to grow on south and southeast facing slopes, warmer slopes that are drier, versus our beeches and our birches and our sugar maples that really want to grow on north, northeast, and northwest facing slopes, which are generally sheltered from direct sunlight and are cooler and moister. Genetics always play a role. This picture here on the left is really important to understand. So this is a farm, a silvopasture farm near me in Watkins Glen, New York. This is Brett Chedzoy's farm, good friend of mine. And he's been doing silvopasture for a long time. And these are two cross sections of sugar maple from the same site. So same soil, same microclimate. All right. So the little cookie there was cut just a few feet away. And these trees are actually the exact same age. So these are both about 90 years old. Okay, so one of them, of course, is close to 3 feet or 36 inches in diameter, and the other one's barely breaking 6 inches in diameter, right? So the reason for the differences in growth, even though these are the same species with the same site conditions, is a genetic expression of their growth potential. And so what Mother Nature does is plant a lot of trees and not know which of those trees is going to be the large giant in 90 years and which is going to be the small suppressed stump at the end of those 90 years, right? And so this is an important lesson for us to think about in the way that we plant trees. We can't assume that every tree we put in the ground is going to be there in 200 or 300 or 400 years, which is the lifespan of a hardwood forest in this time, in this part of the world at least, right? And that's important to think about. Wherever you're tuning in from, what do the trees do naturally? What is the life cycle of a forest? In most cases, it's multiple generations of humans. So you're only seeing the forest in one little subset, one little segment of its entire lifespan, right? Fourth thing I have to add to what makes trees grow is fungi. And we're just getting more and more into this. This is a photo of a white pine seedling from the University of Aberdeen. They've done a lot of great work with mycorrhizal fungi. Myco means mushroom and rhizal means root. And you can see here the brown roots of the white pine and then the white mycelium wrapping itself around all the roots and sometimes penetrating into the roots and not taking from the tree, but actually engaged in a beneficial exchange between the soil and the tree. And the basic trait is the fungi get some of the carbohydrates and sugars that the tree is producing through photosynthesis. And the tree, in turn, gets this incredible extension of its root network where mycelium filaments can actually wrap around individual grains of sand, and they can harvest and break down rock and find minerals and find nutrients and pull water and expand the capacity of the tree to pull all these things in. Many cases, 50 to 75% expansion of the root system. So we can't have good trees without fungi, guaranteed. And when we try to plant trees into a barren pasture that already has had its microbial life decreased and isn't generally a place where fungi are found, then we're missing something there. That's really critical to tree health. And increasingly, what folks are also realizing is that when we talk about carbon sequestration in soil and how forests are so good at this, It's the carbon that's stored and cycled in the mycorrhizal fungi that are really driving those significant numbers. So we got to get into fungi if we're going to get into tree planting. And next week, we're going to dive into a couple specific ways that you can bring fungi into your tree planting, but that's absolutely essential. Anytime there's a tree, there will be fungal networks, but we can do things to strengthen those networks. All right, so our job, knowing those things about trees, is to select really good stock material. And so that doesn't mean just buying any old tree off the web, but really understanding where's the seed originate from that tree, how well has it been grown to date. There's many places you can order trees from where the root system is scraggly and poor, and that tree is not going to do well. What's often best is to actually gather or purchase the seed yourself and grow it out if you can, or take cuttings or actually do that initial propagation to encourage a really robust root system. Once we have those trees and we know they're from a good place and they have that genetic potential, we want to put them in the right place to thrive. So we don't put trees that don't like it wet in wet areas and trees that don't like dry, sunny faces on sunny slopes, right? Things like that. And that before those trees arrive on the farm, we have a really good plan for prepping and planting them in the proper space. So if we bring trees on and we don't have that, what we end up doing is sticking them somewhere, and we've started a process of stressing them out, guaranteed. And if you're guilty of that, well, I can join your club because I am guilty of that as well. And it's a real shame. So we got to do a little bit more prep and planning so we can have more of those trees survive in our landscape. All right. And then if we look at it's nice to look at individual trees, but we really have to also think about forests and how trees really grow together, because it's not really fair. The only place that individual trees grow is when we plant them individually, right? In especially urban areas or backyards, in suburbia and things like that. This is not how Mother Nature plants trees. There's never a single tree planted. It is always a cluster of trees or a grouping of woody vegetation that starts to move and shift the overall composition of a landscape. So what we know from forests is that in a given acre of land, Mother Nature will draw upon a bank of 100,000 seeds. Those 100,000 seeds out of those, maybe 10,000 will germinate and become little seedlings. Out of those 10,000, maybe 1,000 will become saplings, like 1 or 2 inches in diameter and maybe 6 feet tall. And out of those, maybe 100 will actually become the finished forest canopy that is inevitable at some point in the forest's journey. So from 100,000 seeds, we get 100 trees, right? That's a very, that's 0.01% of the seed bank. And the seed bank could include what's in the soil, what's being, dropped from above by birds, what's being blown in by the wind or the water. That seed bank is this genetic roll of the dice that informs what is eventually a forest that is mature and old and consists of just a small percentage of that original information. So that's how forests grow. And they grow in different stages over time. So we can identify 4 major stages here where we have different qualities of the ways the trees are interacting and the different types of forests. And with silvopasture, in most cases, we're working with the A and the B here. We're working with younger forests or forests that are in this stem exclusion phase where most of the trees are of the same age and kind of at the same height, and that thinning can really benefit both the forest and the forage underneath. As we get into C and D, what we run the risk of is damaging really healthy, intact forests. Sometimes a C forest, a canopy transition forest, is good for silvopasture and sometimes not. And in most cases, the D forest, which is sometimes called a climax forest, we want to leave that to be a forest. So we don't necessarily want to introduce livestock. And none of these things are a hard line across the board type thing, but that's generally what we see as we're working with younger and, like I said before, more marginal forests as we go. And these forests engage in not sort of an upward trajectory towards the climax, which is often what's talked about, but really a shifting between these different types of forests. We call that in forestry a shifting mosaic. And so our forests want to have moments in time where there's little vegetation and maybe more diversity in species, moments in time where there's a species that's dominating but maybe crowding each other out, and moments in time where there's trees that have fallen over and died of old age and have created new gaps in the canopy where new forests can grow. And so that mixture of different types of habitats are really, in the larger picture of things, how forests are growing. And we want to keep that in mind. We're not looking for uniform plantings of trees as a way to mimic what the forest does. And then the other thing a forest does is it grows a generation of trees And then it also starts to initiate regeneration, which is when that next generation shows up. And we're just going to kind of mention that silvopasture, we have to think about that at some point, because at some point we may need to leave the animals out and then allow the forest to do its regeneration work, because in most cases those young seedlings won't survive the effects of livestock. And that's why that gap dynamic, number D there, letter D, is often a point in the forest development where we want to think about regeneration, so we don't want to bring livestock in. So what it looks like on our farm, for instance, is that we plant trees always in community. We plant ecosystems. We don't plant individuals. So here's a black locust planting we did back in 2014. Here it is 4 years later. Black locust is a phenomenal tree for silvopasture. I'll talk more about it next week in specific detail, but it has it checks so many boxes of what we're after in our pasture design. And we did the soil conditioning. We did the work with establishing good planting sites and all of that as a community. We did that in this case in a row form. All right. And that's what allowed these trees to succeed and do quite well. So our job with the forest, we always try to plant in groups, in communities, in clusters. We plant dense. We don't want to plant our trees 50 feet apart. We really want to plant, usually in most cases, 3 to 6 feet apart, or a meter apart for folks that work with that system, and then allow those trees to grow up. That's how nature plants trees, and that's how we want to plant trees. And eventually, some of the younger trees will be thinned out over time, or we might thin them out ourselves. Another thought I have with when you're starting to think about planting trees and planting forests is to do smaller test plots. Don't commit to a certain combination or a certain pattern too early in the system or too widespread. So we on our farm, this black locust was something that we planted early on just as a test planting. We also next to this planted honey locust. Those two trees actually aren't related. They just have the same common name. But found out that our site was very well suited to black locust and very poorly suited to honey locust. And I was glad I only planted 20 of each versus if I had gone out and planted 200 of each and learned that lesson the hard way. All right, so a couple things there about learning from our lessons from nature, okay? All right, I'll check for a couple questions, and then we're going to talk finally about our planning process here and sort of some of the questions around layout and spacing of trees and things like that. So let's go grab a few more questions here. Let's see. I'll pick a few that are relevant to what we're talking about right now, and we can certainly circle back to some of these at the end here or next week or whatnot. Just reading here. So I'll answer certainly is black locust toxic to cattle? So toxicity is a kind of a whole nother conversation. Generally, plant toxicity has been found in a couple instances with livestock. It's when the animals have prolonged access to a plant, when they are already sick and looking to medicate themselves, when they are stuck in an area and there's nothing else to eat, or when they're not familiar with pasture and the palate of a diverse species mix in pasture, and so they haven't quite learned how to graze a diverse diet, and they might overeat something as a result. If you start to dig into toxicity cases, those are in the most cases what we see showing up. So black locust, like alfalfa, because actually nutritionally it's very similar to alfalfa, you can have issues if the animals eat too much, and they're similar issues. So toxicity really is because you're overeating a very high crude protein content food. But when animals are only given when they're on a rotation, they're given a limited access and they're familiar with it, we tend to find it not toxic at all to any grazing ruminants or pigs or poultry for that matter. Horses are sometimes a whole different story, but I do know of folks who have fed black locust to their horses. But again, it's in limited amounts and it's on a rotation. It's not something they have continuous access to. So that's the short answer to that one. And I'll just mention about honey locust too, since that kind of tags along to what we were just talking about. My site is not well suited to honey locust for a couple reasons. We have a heavy clay soil, so it's not well drained, and we have a cooler microclimate, higher elevation, and we don't tend to have some of the warming effects of some of the other farms around here that are, for instance, by the lakes. And I think honey locust really likes warm microclimates, and it really likes well-drained soil, because when I go to Virginia, it's thriving there. And I go to the Midwest, it's thriving there. So we're just a little bit too cold and too high of elevation, and our soil has too much clay. And that's a really good example of With any tree species, really understanding what it likes and doesn't like will really lend itself to making sure it goes in the right place. And if you don't know, like I say, you could plant a few and see how it does. But we've killed plenty of trees trying to learn the process, and we'll definitely talk out more of that next week when we talk about why trees die. All right, I'm gonna finish up here with just a few layout comments, and then I'll answer as many questions as I can. Time is always a challenge with these things, but we'll continue our conversation next week for sure. So the first question with layout is if we can find patterns on the site that lend itself to how we're going to lay out our trees. So we're imagining now, okay, I'm going to plant communities of trees. What's that going to look like in terms of spacing, in terms of layout, in terms of the different patterns? And so what we want to first go back to is what the land might offer us. So instances, we might, from the area that we're looking at, notice that the solar orientation is helpful. And if we're planting particular types of trees, we want to think about solar orientation, because if we're interested in the fruit or nut crops that come after those trees, then generally speaking, we want to align those trees with rows that go usually north-south, so that we get even amounts of sunlight on both sides of the tree. If we're not as interested in that, or if we're looking at maybe to remediate the effects of wind on the site, we might think more about how the wind might be affecting our site and plant the trees oriented against the wind. Contour is often really helpful, especially on steeper sites, as an orienting feature for how we plant our trees. And also we have to think about maybe our paddock layout, because the way that we graze our animals is going to be really important to how we work with our trees. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. So just a couple examples here. This is a site in New York that I was working with. This is mostly a woodland conversion type scenario. You can see here, this is a contour map that's showing every line is a drop in elevation or a rise in elevation of 10 feet. So it's a very steep site. So our orienting feature for the way that we would thin this or plant trees would always be around contour, because this is incredibly steep. So that's kind of like an easy one when you have sites that are like that, right? Here's another site. This was a student from our recent online class. A really great example, because this is a paddock that she's grazing. You can see here the red perimeter fence, and then the blue subdivisions those are all permanent fences. And then she was using temporary fence to further divide these and graze different paddocks. There was about each of these little strips was divided into 4 or 5 paddocks. And you can see, though, there's this overlay of how the topography really varies, where you have, for instance, in this second paddock, you have steep slopes that lend themselves to like an upper ridge, then down to steep slopes in a lower area, then back up to another, less steep, but still relatively steep slope, that sort of thing. So we have a dynamic, less uniform suggestion here about patterning. And then when we talked more about this, we realized that the prevailing winds, a really important feature here, this is a high elevation, very exposed site, and you can see all the barn infrastructure here. There's a real big desire to think about using trees also as a windbreak. And so we looked at how the person was dividing up the paddocks, and also where planting trees might be advantageous from an erosion standpoint. So these upper slopes that are highlighted in purple, these are the most prone to erosion areas, these upper slopes here, and also the ones that would remediate the effects of the wind. So that would be winds mostly coming from the west or the left side of the screen here. So we picked these 2 purple areas as the first places to plant, and then recognize some secondary places and so on. But again, we use the site to orient the types of ways that we might think about placing our trees. And then we can think about some different patterns. So most commonly, folks think about a couple different things. We think about planting in rows. And these are rows kind of, not straight, because oftentimes we might use the contour of the site if it lends itself to planting. These are images from the book, by the way, where we look at different row spacing and how many trees per acre that would result in, right? Because the density of that's really important. And these could be straight rows, or they could be along contour, or not necessarily every contour, but a single contour if that's a desired, if it's a slope, it's often a good idea to do that. We could do different kind of random arrangements or clusters that we fence off while the livestock are initially grazing, and create more of a random pattern, which is actually closer to what nature tends to do, or what tends to persist in natural environments. Again, different kind of considerations there. probably most people's minds were often thinking about like a grid pattern or offset grid pattern, like this kind of orchard spacing, right, which has different effects, and this can be challenging if you want to keep grazing, because now you're forced to fence off each individual tree versus groupings of trees, which we can do very easily with our rows or with these sometimes with these clusters, depending on the patterning. And so what we've tended to do with our farm, and I'll show you a couple examples on Google Earth, is focus on contour rows with wide enough spacing, and in some cases straight rows, where we can easily run the animals along our tree lines and keep them out with fencing. And then over time, as those trees get large enough, we can integrate them and shift where the fencing goes, and then it allows us to plant more trees. So let's look at that for a second. I'm going to switch over to Google Earth. This is a tool that I really like for silvopasture planting, and on our Silvopasture book website, you'll find some tutorials about how to use Google Earth from the get-go. It's been incredibly useful for us to do all sorts of planning. So when we look at different aspects, we've been able to integrate things like a contour map to look at the different topography. It looks like the soil map is actually, I didn't mean to turn that on, but the soil map has shown up on here and can tell us a bit about the soils. Let me turn that off. You have to organize your stuff well, or else it gets very confusing here. We mapped out, did some observation on the land, for instance, and mapped out different hydrology and water feature issues. We were able to then take it back in and talk about it in our farm meetings, things like that. And we were able to map out our grazing plan. When we figured out the size of paddocks that we wanted, we can map out our initial grazing plan. And then, of course, when we're out on the field, this might change slightly. It may not be in order. The sizes might shift a bit depending on the time of year and things like that. But it gives us a template and something to work off of as we go. So I just want to show you a couple examples of how we've planned trees in, and then I'll get some questions in. So here's a field. This is in the northwest corner. This is generally a cooler area. Gentle slopes. If we want to look at the landform real quick, we kind of have a gentle slope heading down to what is the northwest. Not as much concern with erosion or things like that. Some concern with cold winds coming in. This hedgerow serves as a very nice windbreak to our house, which is right here on the photo. And so in this instance, our orienting feature for designing how we put plantings into silvopasture was actually the paddocks themselves. We really value, if you look at our larger map here, we really value the sort of uniformity of this paddock system in particular. This is a lot of tree planting along contour, and you can see it makes for some funky paddocks. And it's really nice to have some space that's kind of open, and it creates really uniform paddocks. It gives us a bit of a break from fence moving. We do a lot with net fencing, and so it's nice to have these things. So we wanted to do a planting that fit and allowed us to continue to do that. So just as an example here, we think about ways that we can plant. And what's key is that we don't necessarily achieve our final silvopasture plant configuration in the first planting. We might do multiple plantings, because what we wanted to do is maintain our roughly half-acre paddocks while getting trees established. And what that means for us is we fence the trees out from the sheep, and then we plant them. And then again, after 4 or 5 years, because we're growing all fast-growing species, we can integrate those, and then we can shift the fences, and we can put more trees in, right? So here we go. Here's our grid. So round 1, we're going to plant trees on those white lines outside of our paddocks, right? We're going to wait till those grow up and those can be integrated. And then round 2, we're going to shift, and I'll take off the grazing plan here. So imagine that the trees that are on those white lines have now grown up. All right, and now we're going to plant trees on the green lines. And so essentially our paddocks are now this. So on Google Earth, we were able to measure each of these paddocks and make sure they were still about half an acre each, which makes our grazing easier. But at the same time, we can now have this more grid-based way of planting trees, and it creates in the end pretty decent, like 60 foot by 60 foot squares throughout the property, right? Or throughout this part of the property. Okay, so that worked for maintaining our grazing system and our paddock design, or our paddock sizing, I should say, and shape while planting trees, right? Another example is a part of the farm. If we go up here, this is a large pond, and then we have a more sloped area over here. Let's look at our grazing plan again. We have these paddocks. This is an old vegetable operation that we started grazing a few years ago. And what we realized when we looked at the landform here was that the contour suggested that we might want to take a little more care into the way we oriented our paddocks and our tree planting to work a bit more across the contour. You can see it's kind of moving diagonally from the top to the bottom of the screen. So when we look to do trees in this, we're going to change a little bit. We're going to first change our, put the right things here, our paddocks to be a little more along contour. So if I take off the landform, you can see now they're a little bit shifted to work a bit more with the landscape. That allows us to put trees in between our paddocks again. And then again, we'll shift our paddocks to this other thing here. And then we'll plant trees in on those lines. And then what we'll end up with, if we take all the paddocks up, is we'll end up with nice rows of trees roughly along contour, up and down, and divided into this. And then we can still graze those as half-acre paddocks. Because you can see if we tried to plant all these trees at once, we would have to basically have the size of our paddocks, and it would be really problematic. Right? So that's one way we're going about planting. And I'll just mention on other parts of the farm, we may not be doing a whole field at once. So you can actually see on the map here, here's some swales that we dug. This is the overflow from our pond. We dug some swales, and this became a berm for planting just one single row of trees at a time. So your plantings can be, on a paddock scale, and it might be in multiple planting events, and it can also be on a singular linear scale. The purpose of these swale plantings was really to, again, create a multi-layered windbreak, as well as work with some of the water issues on this rather steep slope as we go here. All right. So what it comes down to be is that each scenario for planting trees becomes its kind of own individual game and its own individual, I like to call it kind of a mystery, because what we're looking for is evidence in the landscape that shows us and gives us the potential, gives us an idea of what we want to orient our design around. So we look for the landscape, we think about our goals, we think about what's achievable. So maybe planting a whole several acres of field wouldn't feel achievable to you, but maybe a one row of trees would feel achievable. And those kind of pieces are all really important as we think about our planting. And so with that, I am going to, I'll hang out for about 5 minutes or so. I have to run a little bit sooner than I'd like, but I will take a few questions. And we'll be able to continue this conversation next week. And we're going to dig a little more into the specifics of some tree species selection. And I mentioned adding fungi to the mix and just tips for success if you're actually going to plant trees and increase their chances to survive.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Steve. Yeah. I don't know if you got to this. I'm just going to scroll up a little bit. There was a question earlier on about how do you protect a new plantation from wildlife predation and protect each tree, tall fence around the entire property, et cetera. There's a couple people that were wondering about that.
Great. So I hope you can tune in next week or at least see the recording, because we're going to talk specifically about the fencing and protection aspect of tree planting. What I'll say at this point is that what's important is to know that it's cheaper to protect a group of trees versus an individual tree. An individual tree can cost anywhere from a couple dollars to $10 to protect, and you drastically reduce that when you start fencing out different groups. And so we'll look at some different photos of strategies for that. You always have to protect your trees from your livestock when they're getting established. You sometimes have to protect them from wildlife. So my question back to you would be, which wildlife? Because depending on the planting and the density and the pressure, you can choose different strategies. It doesn't always have to be a fortress around your trees.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a lot of back and forth between folks, so I'm trying to figure out. I know there was a couple of questions about your class in your book, Steve. If you want to just mention that again, I'll also make sure to send out a link to your websites, but just so folks know what's available now and in the future.
Sure. Yeah. So the online course, as I mentioned, is ongoing. So you can always sign up and join it. it's only offered live once a year, meaning we do 6 weeks of live webinars. Sometimes we've done it twice a year, but often it's once a year. But all the previous webinars from the past 2 years are up there as recordings. So there's plenty to work through. And then the next time we do the live one, you can join in indefinitely. So as long as we're doing the course, you can also join those future live sessions. But signing up for that is all info that's available on the silvopasturebook.com website. And you can also order books directly from me there. And the benefits of doing that are you get my signature, not that it's worth anything, and you also can support us directly, because when you buy the book direct from the author, you always support them a bit more than when it goes through the other channels in bookstores and things like that.
Excellent. Thanks for that plug. Do you want to take one more question, and then I'm going to wrap it up with, okay.
I see one that I think is a great question right now. So question from Michael is silvopasture something done, quote unquote, further along the timeline of a farm? And that is a really individualized question. So I really appreciate it. So I would encourage everyone, depending on where you're at in your process, to start thinking about trees as part of your farm planning. I would, again, if your learning curve is about rotational grazing and managing the livestock, I would focus on their care and welfare first, and that includes good rotational grazing practices, and then add the trees. But if you already feel like that you're coming into it with good livestock experience, I think then you can bring the trees in sooner. And what it takes to get started is really like that first row or that first cluster of trees, and you can always add that in. So rather than feeling like it only counts if you plant 100 trees, well, consider it counting if you plant 10 trees and start there and learn lessons from those trees, because they will teach them to you, and then you can grow from there. We certainly didn't start off by looking at all of our 50 acres. We looked at a very small space and we bit off that piece, and then we bit off a bigger piece. So that's what I'd recommend.
Excellent. Well, just a couple of housekeeping items I wanted to share before when we sign off. A reminder that there is a really quick survey that's going to pop up on your screen immediately after I close out of this webinar. If you would take it either now or sometime the next couple of days, give us your feedback. That would be wonderful. And like I said, a recording of this webinar will be available soon. I'll be sending it out to everyone that registered, and it will also be archived on our website. So Steve will be back with us next week and the following week after that for the second and third installment of this series. I will say that each session does require a separate registration. So if you haven't already registered for the next couple, then please do so. I will include links to those registration forms in my follow-up email to you all. So hopefully it'll be easy to do so. And like I said, we have a bunch of other stuff going on right now. Outside of these webinars, we have grant applications that are being accepted. We have a mentorship program that will be opening applications for next week already. And then we have ongoing scholarships to conferences and events for folks that are looking to do some more learning. So I am afraid that that's all the time we have for today, but I want to give a sincere thank you to you, Steve, for spending the afternoon with us. It's been really nice to have you, and I'm looking forward to the next couple of weeks with you. And thank you to everyone out in the audience. It's really nice that you could be here with us, and for all the great questions. And I'm sorry for anyone that experienced any kind of audio issues. Hopefully those got worked out as we went. So look forward to having you on a future webinar and connecting again soon. Have a great afternoon. Bye, everyone.